Today is Pentecost, obviously a day of fire. If you didn't catch that one, you clearly aren't paying attention. There are things we know about Pentecost, and then there's a whole lot that we don't pay attention to or know about Pentecost. It's one of those great feast days of the church that tends to sort of, well, because it's summer, not everybody's here, and not everybody tends to know, and it gets switched around. So let's start with what we know about Pentecost. It is the day when the Spirit comes among the disciples. There are tongues of flame over their head, and they are sent out filled with the Spirit to preach the good news to all the nations. And as they go outside, they discover that they can speak any language that they need to speak to proclaim that good news. Ultimately, that curse of Babel, the Tower of Babel, where the world is divided and confused, is made new. It's a magnificent moment. It's a moment we call the birthday of the church, or the birth of the church. It's a day that we literally call a red letter day. That is, when the church in England would print giant calendars, for the community. Whenever there was a big important feast day, they would print the letters in red so that you would know it was an important day. So it is a red letter day today. Or, even more elemental as Episcopalians, this is why bishops wear those weird pointy hat things. It's supposed to look like a tongue of fire on their head. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, of course. Depends on their hat, but it's supposed to look like that. These are the things we know about Pentecost. The problem is there's a whole lot more we don't know. One is that Pentecost is Greek for 50 days. It's been 50 days since Easter. But more than that, it's actually a Jewish holiday that was 50 days after Passover. 50 days after Passover, they celebrated a great feast called the Feast of Weeks. They still do. It celebrates two things. The first is they bring together, it is the harvest of wheat in Israel right now. And so they are supposed to bring their first fruits to the temple. This is why Jews from all over the world have come to Jerusalem. This is why they have to speak different languages. The disciples didn't just sort of randomly walk in and find a whole bunch of people who were having a language convention. This was a moment of celebration for Judaism. So there's one side of it, but the even bigger side of it for the Feast of Weeks is this. On this day, Jews celebrate the giving of Torah. That is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But even more, it's the giving of the law. It is the giving of the commandments that mark who Israel is as a people. Those commandments that were received on Sinai. And yes, this is how they talk about them. The commandments are God's fire that purifies them. It is in the same place where there was a burning bush that was burned and yet not consumed. It is a place where God's presence is literally seen as a great pillar of fire over the people. So sorry, Christians, it's not just our day. This is a day that is also sacred to Judaism. It's a day that has historical antecedents that we're supposed to know and be knocking around in our heads. It's why tongues of fire suddenly start to make a little more sense when Luke talks about them. Then there are the two sort of snide comments that happen. They receive these tongues of fire. This new thing is happening. They go out and start preaching. And there are two responses that the crowd makes to this wonderful happening, to this miracle ultimately. They say, well, first, aren't these guys Galileans? And we can translate that in one of two ways. We can just sort of hear it as Galileans. But really what they're trying to say is, hey, how did these hicks suddenly learn French overnight? That's not what usually happens. These uneducated guys don't just magically learn a foreign language. That's one way to say it. The other way, and I love this, it's no less humorous. When the Spirit gives gifts, He doesn't tend to transform us. The Spirit moves amongst us and gives us gifts, but it's still who we are. So there have been some scholars who say that probably what is going on, at least in part, is that, yes, they are given the gift of speaking in tongues, but probably with their homegrown accents. That is, it's sort of like someone saying, "Hola, ¿cómo estás, amigos?" Not exactly fluent in the ways that are perfect but understandable. That's how gifts tend to come, at least for me. In the Spirit, I get about halfway there, and the rest I've got to work on myself to make it fully engage. And then there's the other line. It's a fabulous line where and we know it's important because Peter actually has to respond to it. He says they are full of new wine. These guys are full of new wine, to which Peter has to reply, they're not. No. It's not in the morning. It's too early to be drunk. And we're supposed to laugh at that. That's actually a laugh line. It's supposed to be a moment that is ridiculous. But as a community, as well, a church that can often be called Whiskey-palians, we should probably engage something about that. We are known as a community that likes to enjoy a party and celebrate. My favorite joke for Episcopalians and drinking is this: wherever 3 or 4 Episcopalians are gathered, there will be a 5th. There's a reason we're known for that, and that's because we gather together. The central part of our time together is to have wine together, to celebrate the kingdom that is brought near. And so when we talk about new wine, it's absolutely a historical thing, and it's absolutely metaphor as well. That is, there was this idea in the ancient world of new wine. That was wine that had just been crushed, that they had just put in and was newly out of the fermentation process. Well, but maybe not fully done with the fermentation process. It tended to be stronger wine. It tended to be more filled with alcohol. It tended to be, well, a little bit more trouble. Jesus used the image of new wine to talk about his message in the kingdom. He says, "My message is like new wine, and it will need new wineskins." And that was, the new wine wasn't done fermenting. It was still literally bubbling. It was producing gas and expanding and growing and changing. And so it needs new wineskins. It needs leather that's able to expand with it. Because if you take new wine and you put it in an old wineskin, that is something that is a little bit dried and unable to flex. It will burst. And the Greek word for burst there is schism. There will be schism because of the Word of God. It will expand and transform and change you. This is what Jesus literally says. It is like new wine. As I started to then look at some of this, I found something even more fascinating, something I had never known before. That is, when God makes a promise to Abraham that he will receive a great new land, it is a land flowing with milk and honey. And I know y'all know that because even Episcopalians know that particular verse. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. We know it because it's said not once, not twice, but about 300 times, it seems like, in the Old Testament. And I always thought, I don't know about y'all, I mean, it's a nice image. I like milk and cheese and most dairy products. That sounds great. Honey, okay, that sounds nice too. I don't know if I'm going to lay around all day eating cheese and honey, but that sounds great. But what I found out was the Hebrew word in this case is not for bee honey. It's not for something made from bees. Instead, it is a word used, well, for a drink in the ancient world. A drink where they took wine and they boiled it down and they fortified it. It was a strong drink. And suddenly I started thinking and I realized maybe the promised land is perhaps that most Anglican of things. God's promise is that you will go to a land full of cheese and good sherry. It's a different way of seeing it. Here's the thing with all of this. We can't really name what's going on. The Spirit of God comes and fills the disciples, and they're changed and they're transformed, but we can't get to it with our brains. Not fully. It has to be more with our heart. That is, the only way to talk about it is with metaphor. If you go back and read the story closely again, it is not literally necessarily flames that appear over their heads. It is as tongues of fire. It's like them. It was that, but not quite that. When they talk about the new wine, it's like they are drunk, but they're not quite there. It is like they are changed. Even Peter, when he finally tries to explain it, he has to go with a poem. He goes with a poem from the prophet Joel that talks about alternate ways of viewing the world. They're changed, and all they can do is dream and have waking dreams. They're in ecstatic union. They are in altered states. The power of this day is the Spirit comes among us and changes us, and we can't control it, we can't name it, we can't fully own it. Instead, we just have to live into it and engage it. That is the power of metaphor. One of my favorite quotes about metaphor comes from John Haidt, and this is a great quote, so much so that it's actually in my head from memory, and that is, metaphor is most powerful when it has a literal basis. When there's a literal antecedent, that is, metaphor is the most powerful when it has a literal basis. And here's the best part of the quote. Pure metaphor is corrosive and enfeebling. Think of Prince Charles. He has no power, and it doesn't mean much of anything. That is roughly the idea that we have going on. There is something that happens to these disciples, and it changes them. And so we have to engage it, and we have to listen and celebrate it. It is like there is a wind blowing, is what the verse says. Or it's like a fire that is all at once many things. It is the fire of Torah. It is the presence of God in fire. It is the burning bush. It is God's winnowing presence come near. It is God's purifying fire. It is the fire of the Spirit that sends us out into the world, all at the same time. It is new wine, wine that emboldens us to come to the table and drink together to be God's people. It is new wine that is God's message that bursts out from our hearts. It is new wine that changes and transforms us and bubbles up. It is wine that makes a wonderful celebration and a new way of seeing the world, a way of seeing a land flowing with milk and honey. On this day, we celebrate, my friends, Pentecost and all of its meanings, and with the full knowledge that we can't control God, so it has more than anything I just listed. In fact, infinitely more, because the whole point is that we don't stay in here, we go out and experience the world and share God's message there. So, my friends, as good Episcopalians, I can only say this: enjoy this red letter day, celebrate it, rejoice in it. Or, as good Episcopalians, I would say this: let's drink to Pentecost. Amen.